start this going around, please. Okay, so these are the guide questions for next time, right? We're going to have our first student presentation on Tuesday of a group that's going to be talking about Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And here's what I want you thinking about while you read, right? First, this poem inspired a 13-minute song by the heavy metal band Iron Maiden. I have posted it in the extra resources folder if you're interested in hearing it. It's basically a SparkNotes summary of the song with an 8-minute bass solo in the middle. But what I want you thinking about while you read this poem is what qualities it has that might make it particularly appealing to artists who work in a genre like heavy metal, right? The song that I was playing at the beginning of class, right, is a song by the Canadian metal band Rush that is also based on a Coleridge poem, right? For some reason, metal bands love Coleridge. Try to figure out what that is. Secondly, I want you to think about the poem's relationship to the broader discourse of Romanticism as we discussed it in class, right? What qualities of Romanticism can you pick up in this poem? Third, you will notice that Coleridge makes the spelling and grammar of the poem deliberately archaic, right? Deliberately old-fashioned. Why does he do that? And finally, I want you thinking about what the poem suggests about relationships between human beings and the natural world. All right, so take this down, take a few minutes, and then we'll start talking about the Biographia Literaria by going over the quiz questions, right? Pardon? Yeah, yes, you have permission to snap that if you wish to. Those of you who are going to copy it down, I will still give you time to do that if that's what you prefer. Thank you.
Coleridge was a lot easier to understand after I read Cincinnati, because the first time I read it was before that. It was a lot easier to understand after the fact.
Okay, well, and why was that for you, Alan? What helped you in Cincinnati?
He was talking a lot about imagination versus fancy.
Okay.
And we basically took the entire class going on what Wordsworth did with imagination and fancy in his poems.
Mm-hmm.
So it just made it a lot easier to understand.
Okay.
Of that some of the terms he was using, some of the references he made, like he referenced the river, the Y in his poem, and at first I was like, what in the world is this? But then I understood, oh, that's the place he went to when he wrote his poem.
Right. Yeah, he is talking about an actual physical location he has been to. So we'll get to the whole fancy imagination distinction, certainly. Probably very, very soon. But while people are copying things down, does anybody have any other questions about the text or about what we did last time or about the response papers?
Some response papers due tomorrow. Right?
They are due tomorrow, yes, tomorrow. That's response paper 1 is due tomorrow. And you can write about anything that we've looked at up to this point. Yes?
Can it be a longer passage if we don't count it towards the word count?
How long are we talking about?
Maybe a page?
Not a whole page. Keep it shorter than a page. No longer than a short paragraph. I really kind of want you to keep the focus small, because if you are going too big, then you are going to shoot too broad with the response, right? So, like I said in the instructions, if you see a general tendency in a particular work that you want to point out a couple of examples of, that's okay, right? Just make sure that you're centering it on one specific quote. But you can provide those other little examples in the body of your work. Yeah, Ashley.
Like, if we, like, when it comes to, like, our main idea, we have our
Mhm.
main idea that we take from our work. Is it all right if we reference other things from the passage that we got our main idea from? Like, our general little theme from, in order to go forward toward our argument?
Yeah, as long as you can relate everything back to that main idea, right? I don't want a jumble of different ideas that bear no relationship to each other. Yeah, just try to keep it focused. But yeah, you can certainly do that. And look, one thing I do want to say too, right? If you guys have questions about the response paper, if you want somebody to look it over before you turn it in, or if you want to ask me, like if you want to run an idea by me before you really get into writing it, please, right, feel free to do so, right? Shoot me an email or come to my office, right? I'm in the office today after class, and yeah, I'm in the office today after class till about 1:45, and then I am also probably going to be around after 3:15, but not for very long. So if you want to come talk to me about what you're working on, please do. If you want to shoot me an email about what you're working on, please do. I will still be checking email tonight and tomorrow. This also goes for when you're having difficulties with the reading, right? If there are difficult passages in the reading you're having a really hard time with, please feel free to shoot me and copy the passage out for me and say, like, I have no idea what this means. Can you help? And I probably won't tell you what it means. I'll probably ask you a bunch of questions that will help you get to what it means. But, right, I will do my best to help you understand it, right? Two other things when you're reading particularly difficult and dense works like this, right? It can often help to try to put things in your own words, right? So if you can't quite understand at first blush what, say, somebody like Coleridge is saying in a particular passage, just try to put it into your own words. This may require looking some words up, right? That's okay. That's perfectly fine. But it will help you understand his thought process. Okay, is everybody done copying this down? Can I take this down now? Okay, great. All right, so like I said, I think I want to start by just sort of quickly going over these quiz questions, because these kind of get at the meat of what this essay is about. And then we'll look to specific questions or concerns that you guys have about Coleridge. And somebody did ask what Coleridge was on when he wrote this. Coleridge actually was addicted to opium.
See, there you go.
It was a commonly prescribed drug for people who suffered from rheumatism in the early 19th century. So yeah, he developed rheumatism. His doctor prescribed him what was called laudanum. Which is, it's essentially opium dissolved in alcohol. And so, I'm not going to say there's necessarily direct correlation between Coleridge's drug addiction and much of his output, but it is true that much of his output, even before he becomes addicted to laudanum, tends to be much more dreamlike and densely metaphorical than Wordsworth's output, right? So we saw Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey last time, basically looking at a river valley with a ruined abbey in it and describing what he saw and how it made him feel, right? Not a lot of metaphorical content in Tintern Abbey. Pretty much everything Coleridge writes is metaphorical or allegorical. Does everybody know what I mean by allegory? Okay. Okay, let me put it to you. Does anybody know what an allegory is? Okay, what's an allegory?
Oh gosh, I can't.
I can give like an example.
Okay, give me an example.
If you sent from heaven with a set of horns type thing. Or it's like not contradictory, but like
Like an oxymoron?
I don't even really know what that is.
I
I'm trying to. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I can't explain it.
Okay, so here's what allegory means, right? So an allegory is any text that has meaning on more than one level. Right? Intentional meaning that's on more than one level, right? Because we can always interpret texts in ways that the author didn't necessarily intend. That doesn't mean the interpretation is invalid, right? But an allegory is directly written to mean one thing on the literal level, right? There's usually like a narrative. And something else on a symbolic level. So I don't know if any of you are familiar at all with the Pilgrims Progress, which is the most boring novel ever written, but I digress. Right, so narratively, the Pilgrims Progress is a very, very simple story, right, in which a character called Christian travels through various symbolic locations like the Slough of Despond, or the Swamp of Despair, basically, and Apollyon's castle, right, where there's a great big monster that lives. All the symbolism is very, very simple and kind of on the nose, and it's basically about a human being's progress towards Christian salvation, right? So there's that very simple narrative on the surface level, and everything in the narrative symbolizes something else. Coleridge often writes in this kind of much more often than is typical for a romantic poet. He's much more influenced by allegory than someone like Wordsworth, who is largely writing about what he sees. Wordsworth also tends not to write narrative poetry. Coleridge writes a lot of narrative poems, right? Poems that actually tell a story. Okay, so let's look at this first question here, right? What does Coleridge say is the prime merit of genius, right? So I tried to quote directly from the Biographia Literaria here to try to give you some clues to where like what part of the text you would find that information. Yeah, Alan.
This is my guess.
Okay, go ahead.
As you can guess. The ability of a poet to have someone feel those childlike wonders as an adult, like Wordsworth likes to write about. With his, he quoted that one poem, like making the Alps like fiery columns of like sun, I think.
Yeah.
Just looking at everyday common things that we lose the wonder of because we see them so often, and looking at them in a new light that makes them interesting again.
That's exactly right. This is one thing that Coleridge and Wordsworth have in common, right? They both believe that the poet's primary function is to renew sensation, right? To try to get those deadening effects of habit out of the way so that you can feel things like they're new again, or so you can feel sense impressions like they're new again. So, yeah, the prime merit of genius for Coleridge is a kind of renewal of feeling. All right. Now what about number 2 here? The fancy and the imagination. What are these two things and how do they differ?
I think imagination is broken up into like 2 different categories for Coleridge.
Yeah, he breaks the imagination up into 2 parts. But we'll worry about that in a minute, right? We'll worry about defining what the fancy and the imagination are first, right? Let's start with the fancy. What is the fancy?
Observing things through the fixities, as he calls them, kind of observing objects with things we already know about them.
Like knowledge.
Basically, yeah. So the fancy, right, is just what we do with the sense impressions we take. And the fancy is the part of our mental process that just takes in sense impressions and rearranges them, right? We go out and, we go out to the river and we observe a fisherman, and he gets attacked by a bear, right? So we take in all those sights and sounds and smells, and then we maybe put them in a different order when writing a story or a poem about them, right? But it's all working with pre-existing materials in our memory that we don't really change, except to rearrange them, right? So the fancy just takes in and rearranges sense impression. Now this is directly influenced by philosophical trends in Coleridge's day, right? I think we may have talked, pardon?
Plato?
Not Plato, actually. Plato is much more, a much bigger deal in Wordsworth than he is in Coleridge. Did we talk at all about empiricism a few sessions ago? Does anybody remember what empiricism is?
It's relating to the fear.
Yeah, well, when we talk about like empirical data in an experiment, right? How did we get that data?
The data we observe.
Exactly. Yeah, empirical data is data that we observe through sense impressions, right? So an empiricist believes that all knowledge ultimately comes from our senses, right? The only things we can know are things that we sense. Shortly before Coleridge starts writing, there's a Scottish philosopher by the name of David Hume who argues that because we only take in, like we only know what we take in through our senses, we can't really know anything for sure. So, you know, the only reason we know the sun is going to come up in the morning is because it always has. We don't know that it's going to come up tomorrow morning. We assume it will based on our experience, which he would argue is fallacious logic, right? So,
Isn't it like sublime thinking in a way? Like,
how so?
Cause when we talked about it, we talked about them also doing stuff in that same way, like not seeing it, not anything, it's not possible for it to happen any other way. You know? So is that like in a way, you know?
I would say that actually empiricism would probably be more related to the sublime's opposite, the beautiful, right? Because the empiricism is just about empiricism is not so much about how you process what you take in. You're just taking stuff in, right? Your mind is a blank slate that your senses leave impressions on. So the fancy, the idea of this is related directly to empiricist philosophy. And for Coleridge, inferior poets rely on the fancy, right? All they do is take in sense impressions and rearrange them. All they do is take in things they already know, things they've already read or whatever, and put them into different patterns. So what's the imagination, and how is the imagination different from the fancy?
It is taking those senses, but disregarding any pre-knowledge we have about them and creating new
Recreating.
units or unities.
Yeah, the imagination is still taking in sense impressions, right? But it's melting them down and creating something new from them, right? So I'll give you an example. There's a mythical beast called a Manticore, right? Now, a Manticore has a lion's head, a man's face, a scorpion's tail, and dragon's wings, right? Now, does any such creature actually exist? God, no, right? No. These creatures do not exist. What someone has done is taken a variety of features of other animals with which they are familiar and melted them down into some new creation, right? To give you an example of how the fancy would work according to the same process, in the Travels of Marco Polo, he describes a creature as a unicorn, but he says it doesn't look anything like a unicorn is supposed to look, right? It's enormous and gray and has great big baggy skin and a horn right on the front of its snout. So what's the animal he's actually describing?
Rhinoceros?
Yeah, he's describing a rhinoceros, but he's trying to simply assimilate it to his own sense experience, rather than accepting that this might actually be something new. So that's just to sort of illustrate the difference between fancy and imagination, right? Imagination is doing something new and different with those sense impressions. It's not just rearranging them. Okay, do we understand that distinction? This is actually probably the most important thing to get from Coleridge. So the fancy is influenced directly by empiricism. The imagination comes from Coleridge's reading of a German philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant accepted a lot of the basic premises of empiricism. Okay, yes, we gain knowledge through sense impressions, but he said there are also things that we're aware of without direct contact with our senses, right? For example, we are aware of the passage of time, but we don't have any particular sense that tells us time is passing, right? We are able to discern that time is passing by melting together our sense impressions in a particular sequence, right? So that's kind of where Coleridge is coming from as far as that's concerned, right? Any questions about fancy and imagination? Everybody get this? Everybody on board? All right, great. Okay, so third question here. Does Coleridge agree with Wordsworth's argument that the language of poetry is no different from the language of prose?
No.
Hell no, right? So what is Coleridge's basic problem with that argument?
Puts poetry in the language of the, is what you would consider simple.
Uh-huh.
Well, he feels that it's too important to leave it in those kind of words.
Yeah, what's the problem with writing poetry using the vocabulary of a simple rustic, according to Coleridge? Yeah, can I?
Well, what I got from it was that it's basically not much like some people lack knowledge. Some your
Mhm.
class. That's what I was gonna ask you.
Okay.
You mentioned class twice
Sure.
on page 497
Mm-hmm.
about people can always tell you about their experiences. Like, so you mentioned objects in which rusty people are familiar with,
Uh-huh.
and the sounds that they're familiar with, the food and shares that they're familiar with, will be different from someone that is of higher class.
Right.
That can tell you,
Mhm.
you know, can say more in prose.
Right.
As to what, you know, you may not
Sure.
relate to as
Sure.
as a clergyman or a peasant. You might not relate
Uh-huh.
to what a nobleman, cause you know.
Sure.
That's what I wrote in my paper.
Yeah.
That's something I got.
And I think, yeah, that when we look at, say, somebody like Wordsworth, how easily then could Wordsworth actually get into the mind of a simple rustic peasant?
You can understand it for the most part.
You can understand the vocabulary, right? But can
Not to
he
me.
honestly and realistically depict simple rustic life?
No, because he's never experienced it.
Yeah. You know, Wordsworth is a gentleman who's been to university, right? Who doesn't have the same vocabulary and the same experiences as, you know, say, a simple villager somewhere in the west of England, right? He can go out and live in Dove Cottage out on the lake as long as he wants, but the fact of the matter is, right, that his experiences are not those of the people he often claims to be writing about. And I think this also sort of gets to that issue of vocabulary. What's the problem with writing poetry for Coleridge in a very rustic vocabulary?
Doesn't it diminish the word?
Well, why would it diminish the art?
Like, it's, we've been talking about class and how, like, oh my gosh, I can talk today. And how, like lower class people can possibly understand, like, how amazing poetry is and, like, so making a poem in their language. Both.
So,
No, it's okay.
and what I was going at, what she was saying is to some poets, it's not real. Like,
Mhm.
the real men language. You know what he mentions
Yeah.
that too. What page is that? It's just on 498 at the top.
Okay.
He said a selection of the real language of men, the language of these men in low and rustic life. I propose myself to imitate and as far as possible to adopt the very language of men. And when he says that he wants to adopt the very language of men,
Mhm.
he's not saying the men that's talking all, high class and stuff.
Right.
He's talking about the common language that everybody
Yeah.
can relate to. So whether you're Bishop Taylor or whether you're Algernon and Sydney, you
Mhm.
can relate to, you can, read
Mhm.
it and understand.
But a lot of what Coleridge is saying is that there is no real common language of men. It's like that the language you use is largely determined by your class, your education, and your experiences, right? So if you are writing according to a different set of class expectations and class principles, right, then in a sense, you're essentially writing inauthentic poetry, right? You're writing kind of window dressing. Now, I do want to point to something in that passage that just below that passage, Kanaya just cited on page 498.
His first individuality and stuff, that order that he has going on, first, second, and third, of what a man's common language is.
Actually, slightly above that.
Okay.
Thinking more generally, right? I object in the very first instance to an equivocation in the use of the word real. Every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activity of his feelings, and the depth or quickness of his feelings. So if we turn back then to page 497, when he talks about rustic life as material for poetry, right? As little can I agree with the assertion that from the objects with which the rustic hourly communicates the best part of language is formed. For first, if to communicate with an object implies such an acquaintance with it as renders it capable of being discriminately reflected on, the distinct knowledge of an uneducated rustic would furnish a very scanty vocabulary. So what does this mean? The distinct knowledge of an uneducated rustic would furnish a very scanty vocabulary. No, it's not that they can't talk.
I
right?
can talk, but
Yeah.
they don't have the fancy words.
They don't have the higher education to
Mhm.
understand the higher prose of the highbrow poetry.
Right. The vocabulary that they use is going to be much smaller, just on the sheer basis of language, right? And Coleridge is arguing, whether you agree with this or not, that the breadth of their experience is going to be much narrower, right?
They don't have the authority to talk on.
Yeah. In part, what that means, if you are limiting yourself to the vocabulary and the viewpoint of a simple peasant, then you are limiting what your poetry can be about unnaturally, right? There were certainly people who were peasant poets writing in this period, but they were fairly rare. Yeah, Alan, what were you going to say?
And just a few lines lower than that, he basically attributes common language to that of like animal sounds. It is more than probable that many classes of the group creation possess discriminating sounds by which they can convey to each other the notices of objects concerning food, shelter, and safety. Basically, he's saying, okay, yeah, they can look at things and almost communicate in almost an animal fashion, and if you try to communicate your poetry through that, it's just noises.
So Coleridge we can agree, is probably a bigger snob than Wordsworth, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like either way it's kind of bad, and in a way Wordsworth kind of fetishizes, and maybe that's too harsh of a word, this
Mhm.
idea of what rustic people are.
Yeah.
And Coleridge is just kind of just rude.
Yeah, well, and if you look at
He sounded mad at one point. In my head when I went over,
Yeah.
he sounded like he fussy.
Yeah, well, and by the time Coleridge is writing this sort of large theoretical disquisition on poetry, right, he and Wordsworth have had a big falling out, right? So they worked together in the 1790s, right? Lyrical Ballads was a joint volume. It contained, I think, 17 poems by Wordsworth and 4 by Coleridge, but Coleridge's poems were much longer. Because, like I said, Coleridge tended to prefer to work in a kind of more narrative form, and Wordsworth preferred lyric, right, which doesn't have to tell a story. Yeah, Ramona.
You can actually see that from the writings.
Mhm.
The first readings of Coleridge that we had, where he was praising Wordsworth,
Sure.
saying he's this imaginative genius and all that. And by
Mhm.
the time we write this, he's like really scathing towards Wordsworth's process.
Yeah. And I think like a lot of what he's doing here is like, it's not a problem he has necessarily with Wordsworth's poetry. His problem here is with Wordsworth's theory of poetry, right? The problem here is not the poems, it's the ideas.
Right.
And he's arguing that Wordsworth's notion of poetry is a false notion, right? That he's not even really aware of what he himself is doing. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you touch more on, here, I'm kind of slightly confused at these. It's, the bottom of 498.
Okay.
It says, neither is the case rendered at all more temple by the addition of the words in a state of excitement.
Uh-huh.
For the nature of a man's words, when he is strongly affected by joy, grief, or anger, must necessarily depend on the number and quality of the general truths, conceptions, and images, and of the words expressing them. I just want to stop right there.
Okay.
What was he getting at when he quoted Wordsworth?
Uh-huh.
And he said, which we associate ideas and statement of excitement.
Mhm.
What is he getting at by adding in like grief, anger, joy, and
Okay.
putting it on the blank canvas? What is it?
Okay, sure. So, what does Wordsworth regard as the means by which a person generates poetry? What's that process? Okay, feeling, right? Feeling is part of the process, right?
Thought
What-
after the fact.
Thought, yeah. Powerful overflow of spontaneous feelings, right? Recollected in tranquility. But,
Just sit and ruminate on it.
yeah, you sit and you ruminate on it, you think about these powerful feelings and the things that cause these powerful feelings, and you reflect that back out onto your environment. The problem Coleridge has with that is that, one, it's not distinguishing between different types of feeling, right? He's just talking about spontaneous overflow of feeling. Okay, which ones? Categorize those feelings, please. And that if you sit in tranquility and try to recollect those powerful feelings, right, then you may lose that impulse that those feelings gave you. Right? If you're just sort of sitting back and trying to shape these feelings of awe or of anger or of grief or of lust or whatever that you've experienced, the feelings kind of deaden and go away, right? And if what you're trying to do is reawaken people's sensations, then this is not the way to go about it.
Which Wordsworth did by putting those feelings on other people, like his sister.
Yeah, Wordsworth uses other people as repositories for his own feelings. Yeah. Well, he's the James Taylor of poetry. Everything's about himself.
If it's not off topic, why did they have a falling out?
I don't recall the exact. Some of it was Coleridge's increasing unreliability. Yeah. Coleridge was even before his addiction was. First of all, they sort of divided the labor in their joint projects, right? Wordsworth was going to be the poet, and Coleridge was going to be the theorist. And so I think there's some resentment on Coleridge's part of Wordsworth's intrusions on his turf and his territory, right? In part because Coleridge was better read than Wordsworth was, and much more deeply knowledgeable about and interested in philosophy than Wordsworth. I think that a lot of their falling out actually did also concern disagreements over the nature of, these guys lived, ate, and breathed poetry and poetic theory, right? And so this was something that to them would have been important enough to actually fall out over. to actually disagree over it and sort of sever the friendship. They kind of reconcile a little bit later in life, but they're never particularly close again.
It seems to me that also in the passages that we read, Coleridge brings up a couple of different times the amount of poems that Wordsworth had
Mhm.
versus his small collection. He always
Yeah.
brings the fact back that he feels that he didn't contribute that much to it, but with
Some of that's also a little bit of false modesty. If we're actually looking like word for word, line for line,
right.
there's almost as much Coleridge in Lyrical Ballads as there is
Because
Wordsworth.
while he only had 4 in it,
Yeah.
they're huge.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sure. And I think, like I said, some of that is sort of false modesty and a little bit of flattery of Wordsworth as a poet, right? But it is also an acknowledgement that Coleridge's process as a writer tended to be much slower. He did not produce work as quickly as Wordsworth did.
he talks about that as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Now that you said that he didn't produce it as quick as he did, now I'm looking further into 499, on page 499.
Okay, sure.
When he's talking about repetition and stuff of habitual phrases and that stuff, and he mentions the song of Deborah. I've never read it, but when he mentioned that at her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay down at her feet, he bowed, he fell, where he bowed, there he fell down dead. I found it a little funny how he said that that was his way of keeping his subject. If he felt that he was losing track, it was time of giving him time to recollect himself. Was he was he being funny right there? 'Cause
Maybe a little, yeah. I mean, the quote it's from the Book of Judges. It's from an episode. Are you familiar with this line or with this with the episode that's referred to?
I think so.
Okay, it's the person who bows and falls down dead here is an Assyrian general by the name of Sisera who has invaded Israel or Judea or Israel or Judah, whichever one. I think it was just a joint kingdom at that particular time, and his army is defeated by the Israelites, and so he runs away, goes to a local woman's tent to hide out, and she lulls him into a false insecurity, lulls him to sleep, and then once he's asleep, drives a tent spike through his head and kills him. So that's what's being referred to here. So I don't know. I think it's interesting that he chooses this particular line to illustrate Wordsworth's love of repetition in poetry. I'm not really quite sure what to do with that. Some of this might be joking on his part. Yeah, I mean, he's also, remember, he's writing for an audience that would be probably much more intimately familiar both with the Greek and Latin epics and with the King James Bible than would be common today, right? Pretty much anybody who would have picked up Biographia Literaria when it was first published in the early 19th century would have immediately got that reference. Okay, so last quiz question here. What are the qualities of a poet described in ideal perfection? Once again, I was trying to direct you to a particular passage here. What's that? Form? Okay, form is important. Form matters, right? So if you look on page 496, right, the paragraph that begins, the poet described in ideal perfection brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. This power, first put in action by the will and understanding and retained under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control, reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, so on and so forth, right? So the basic point of this, right, if we were to summarize this down, to perhaps a single sentence, is what the poet does in ideal fashion is fuse opposites together into a kind of unity, right? The poet takes things that are disparate, that are diffused, and melts them together into something new, right? Melts them together into a particular unity, much like the function of the imagination, as he describes it, right?
Versus fancy?
Yeah.
Like, would you consider those opposites?
Yeah, he would regard imagination and fancy and imagination they're not really opposites, they're related tendencies, right? Yeah, the fancy is important, right? It helps you take in and reorganize sense impressions, but it's the imagination that melts those impressions down and turns them into new things.
Was he a Christian?
Pardon?
Was he a Christian? Was he a Catholic or something?
He was not conventionally Christian in his early career, in the 1790s, early 1800s.
Wordsworth or Coleridge?
Coleridge.
Yeah, because
Still talking about Coleridge. He became conventionally religious later in life. So, yeah, by the time he's writing this, he is, sort of very much attached, if not so much for religious reasons, for cultural reasons, to the Anglican Church and to its more conservative branches.
Yeah, I was reading that. Okay, when you told us to focus more on number 3, I focused more on number 3, and I did more research. So
sure.
I read an article from a professor at Harvard. I forgot his name,
Uh-huh.
but he said something about when you compare imagination. This professor said he used it as a blank canvas in the mind, somewhat of what God did when He created the different songs of the Bible or something.
Sure. And again, and Coleridge uses some language that sort of hints at that, right? That the poet's function is not unlike God's function as creator, right? But the point there is still like, the imagination isn't just a blank canvas, right, that you rearrange pictures on. You make something new on it, right? That's the difference between imagination and fancy. Okay, so what other, do you have a question or a comment, Ramona?
Can you repeat your ideal perfection sentence?
Okay, sure. That what a poet does in ideal perfection is unify disparate or diffuse impressions, right? And melt them together into something new, right? Into some kind of whole. Yep. So the goal of poetry for Coleridge seems to be a kind of imaginative unity. Right, so the poet doesn't just dream new things up, he also imposes order on these new things. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left, and like I said, I know this was hard stuff, so do people have particular questions about particular parts of this that were difficult or that you didn't understand?
There was one word I never got a chance to look up that I didn't understand.
Okay, shoot.
Gotta find it. It's on page 490.
Okay.
With desimonomize, near the middle of where is it? A certain collective unconscious good sense working progressively to desimonomize, something like that. It's a long
Okay.
word.
I can't find this. Can you be more specific about where it is on page 490?
It's up on the American Code.
It's in the large paragraph. It starts with this excellence, right in the middle. The sentence before it.
You look like
Diane
Diane
from
Synonym.
or something. You look Diane from the 2, and you'll see this.
Right here.
This synonym.
Okay, yeah, show me where it
Two
is.
lines
Okay.
below, imagine.
De-synonymize. De-synonymize. Okay, so what is a synonym?
So what's the synonym?
Synonym means the same words that mean
Yeah,
the same.
a synonym are two words that mean not quite the same thing, but more or less the same thing, right? There are very few true synonyms in any given language because language we tend to drop words that we don't really need, right? But yeah, to de-synonymize means that he's going to take two words that are usually regarded as meaning more or less the same thing, and he's going to uncouple them from each other, right? He's going to show that no, actually, these two things I'm talking about, these two faculties that I'm discussing here are actually quite different.
Like deconstruction.
Yeah.
So that's like.
So that's why he broke down imagination and fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, he's giving you the etymology of both of those words. It's a fantasy. Fancy comes from the Greek fantasia, and imagination comes from the Latin imaginatio, right? So one of the things he's doing is showing off his learning a little bit.
Oh, wow.
But he is also demonstrating, like, because these words actually come from different linguistic roots,
They're not
right?
the same.
Yeah, they're not quite the same thing. So yeah, desynonymize means to uncouple two synonyms, right? It's not a word I've ever seen anywhere else. I think it's his own little coinage, but yeah, that's what he means. So what other questions do you guys have about this?
I don't know if this is a particularly coherent question,
Uh-huh.
but do you have any tips on how to read texts that are like this? Because I found this very, and I'm
Mhm.
usually a very good reader.
Sure. Well, the first thing I will tell you is go slowly, right? Read very slowly. Do not try to skim this for the gist, because you're going to miss it, right? It's just not going to occur to you, right? So read slowly, and when you encounter passages that don't make immediate sense to you, paraphrase, summarize, try to put into your own words. If you are unable to do that, do not start packing up yet. We are not done. All right? I hate when people do that. That pisses me off to no end. I'm sorry if I'm boring you. I'm sorry if I'm keeping you from another appointment or from checking your goddamn text messages, but do not pack up until I am finished. Thank you. I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry for that. But please, it is incredibly rude to start packing up before you are dismissed, okay? Not again. All right, where was I?
Paraphrasing.
Paraphrasing, yes. Summarize and paraphrase, right? Look words up if you don't understand them. And always make notes for yourself in the margins that point out to you where important passages are, right? It is also going to be a good idea to try to follow as closely as you can the guide questions that I'm giving you in class, right? Because those are going to indicate to you the things that I think are particularly important and that are likely to show up on quizzes and exams, right? That's going to indicate to you what I want you to get out of this. Do you have any, does that help? Okay. The other thing to do, right, despite what just happened a minute ago, I am generally a nice and reasonable person if you want to ask me questions about something, right? Provided you do so in a polite and respectful manner. So please, if you are confused about something, email me or come to talk to me in my office, and I will happily go over it with you.
Something that helped me with this particular passage, it might just be me, is I actually read it out loud to myself, and that helps a little bit kind of with the flow of
Yeah,
how it
well,
went.
and the other thing about, that's actually a good idea, because sitting down and reading something out loud forces you to slow down and to pay more attention to individual words, right?
Don't try
So-
and read it all at once.
It is also often, if you find that you are getting bogged down,
So think on it.
yeah, go do something else and put it on the back burner in your brain. Right? Let it percolate a little bit. Sometimes trying too hard to understand something on your first read is going to hurt you more than it's going to help you. Right? So, go get a snack, do your laundry, check your email, whatever, and just let what you've read simmer in your brain. And when you come back to it, you'll be looking at it with fresh eyes again, right? Other questions, sort of more specifically about today's material. Is there anything that is still unclear or that you had any questions about regarding today's reading? You did, yes. And asking questions is good, right? It shows you're paying attention. It shows that you are actually sort of awake and interested. So one last thing that I do want to point to that regards a question that I got at the beginning of class before most of you were here, but I think it's a valuable point when we're trying to understand what Coleridge is up to. Right, if we look on page 488, when he's first talking about Wordsworth's early poetry. Right, during the last year of my residence at Cambridge, I became acquainted with Mr. Wordsworth's first publication entitled Descriptive Sketches, and seldom, if ever, was the emergence of an original poetic genius above the literary horizon more evidently announced. In the form, style, and manner of the whole poem, and in the structure of the particular lines and periods, there is a harshness and acerbity connected and combined with the words and images all aglow, which might recall those products of the vegetable world, where gorgeous blossoms rise out of the hard and thorny rind and shell within which the rich fruit was elaborating. The language was not only peculiar and strong, but at times knotty and contorted, as if by its own impatient strength, while the novelty and struggling crowd of images, acting in conjunction with the difficulties of the style, demanded always a greater closeness of attention than poetry, at all events than descriptive poetry, has a right to claim. So this is itself a thorny and knotty and contorted kind of passage to get through, right? So what is it that makes this passage difficult? What is Coleridge doing instead of just sort of telling you what he thinks about Wordsworth's poetry? How is he framing this?
He's using heavy metaphor instead of being like forthright with it.
Yeah, this is densely metaphorical here, right? And what is the metaphor that he's chosen? Vegetables. Yeah, vegetables, right? Plants.
Organic.
Yeah, that Wordsworth's poetry is like a plant pushing its way out of the ground, right? And not a plant that is being checked or pruned or whatever by a gardener, but a plant that's being allowed to just blossom freely in whatever directions it wants to go, right? It's using its own impatient strength to push its way out of the ground and to go in whatever direction. Right, so that is key to understanding Coleridge, right? Is his tendency to think in these densely metaphorical, more dreamlike kind of terms. Wordsworth typically kind of says what he means. Coleridge doesn't always. Coleridge couches his language in metaphor. So the other thing to note is, as Ramona said, right, this indicates Coleridge's romanticist sympathies, right, in that this is very much an organicist kind of metaphor, right? That poetry is something that grows up out of the earth, or grows up out of some kind of natural circumstances, rather than something that is pretty pictures being rearranged. Okay, so that is all I have for you. Now you may pack up and go. I mean that, you can, right? It's okay. But honestly, like, if you are this bored and anxious to get out of here at this point in the semester, this class is probably not for you.